Welcome to Tokyo College online event, lecture by Dr. Meshel. My name is Mino Takashi. I'm Deputy Director of Tokyo College, the University of Tokyo. Today we have Dr. Meshel with us to give us a lecture. Dr. Meshel is a senior lecturer at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Israel. He belongs to the Faculty of Humanities, the Department of the Bible, and the Department of Comparative Religion. The topic today that Dr. Meshel is going to talk about is the ritual environment. You will soon understand what this ritual environment actually means. I think it's very interesting to see how these ritual matters are related with the environmental matters. After the presentation by Dr. Meshel, I will invite two commentators from the University of Tokyo to give their comments and questions. Then, hopefully, there will be some time to accept questions from the audience. And if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So the time is limited, so I would like to start the lecture. So Dr. Meshel, are you ready?
Thank you.
Go ahead, please.
Just I'd like to thank Tokyo College for the opportunity to have this conversation today. In particular, Deputy Director, Professor Takashi Mino. So thank you. And also, I would like to thank the two respondents. You can hear me okay? Yeah. I'd like to thank Professor Mayumi FUKUNAGA and Professor Sai NAKAMURA. Of course, Professor Satoshi Ikeuchi from RCAST, who has allowed this entire visit to take place. And last but not least, Professor Dr. Yamashiro Koji for allowing my stay here to be possible and for the intellectual interchange during my period here at Tokyo University. Maybe we can show the next slide. This is an experimental talk, and it arose in conversation with three other colleagues of mine who are affiliated with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Professor Yael Mishael, who is somewhere, I believe there right now, she's an environmental chemist from the Soil and Water Department at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the head of the Center for Sustainability at the Hebrew University. And Dr. Hillel Mali, a Talmudist and an expert in ancient Jewish literatures, has also joined us today. Yehuda Jungstein has also helped in preparing some of the thoughts for today's conversation. So just a clarification of terms before we begin. When I use the term biblical or Israelite, I refer to something meaning, something originating from or characteristic of the Hebrew Bible or the ancient Israelite societies that produced it, roughly the first millennium, mid-first millennium BCE, give or take a few centuries. By Jewish, I mean characteristic of a somewhat later culture and a later corpus beginning towards the end of the first millennium BCE and into the first centuries CE and beyond. It is rabbinic Judaism that produced the Mishnah and the Talmud, the quintessential texts of traditional Jewish learning down to modern times. Ritual is a slightly difficult term to define. It encompasses a vast array of human, perhaps animal behaviors characterized by regularity and fixedness, but also innovation and creativity. In the wake of Catherine Bell's writings, it's become increasingly popular to speak not of ritual versus non-ritual dichotomy, but rather degrees of ritualization within a spectrum of human behaviors. For the purposes of today's discussion, it's worthwhile highlighting one aspect of ritualized action, namely that it, by definition, comprises non-goal-oriented activities. Partially as a result of this, it's often extravagantly wasteful from a this-worldly perspective. In the ancient world, both ancient Israel and in India, the study of ritual was far from a remote corner of intellectual activity. As Fritz Stahl, the Dutch-American Indologist, put it, the study of ritual in ancient India, together with linguistics, with which it is inextricably intertwined, it played a role that's somewhat comparable to the role of mathematics in our societies, at least since the Renaissance. In other words, just as nowadays, we tend to use mathematical language to describe and to analyze phenomena that, at least ostensibly, are not inherently arithmetic. So physics, chemistry, linguistics. So too in ancient India, the intertwined sciences of grammar and ritual, specifically sacrificial ritual, served as the language, as it were, by means of which other domains of knowledge were discussed. They provided analytical frameworks and a basic vocabulary for their description. In ancient Israel, which is the focus of our conversation today, I think it would be fair to say that the study of ritual was sort of the queen of sciences, constituting the single most complex analytical edifice surviving from ancient biblical and then early Jewish writings. I've argued at length in the past that complex and intricate biblical system of ritual sacrifice is governed by a grammar that is to a degree homologous with the grammars of natural languages. The intuition, by the way, goes back to the classical Sanskrit Indian grammarians. Together with the system of ritual purity, with which it is deeply linked, sacrificial laws comprise about 1/2 of the Torah, so 1/2 of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, or the earliest canonized section of the Hebrew Bible, and 1/3 of the Mishnah, the classical Jewish law code on which the Talmud is based. Now, sacrifice and purity rituals served as a model for thinking about fundamental questions of the relation between culture and nature, already in biblical times, very much as Claude Lévi-Strauss and Mary Douglas argued in very different ways. The way they view ritual systems as sort of theoretical equations played out in societal behavior. The study of these rituals, the study of sacrifice specifically, provided the ancient priests and scholars in ancient Judaism with a template for thinking about the most fundamental human questions, and this also includes early Christian writers. The study of sacrifice also served as an intellectual battlefield, so to speak, where the most sophisticated arsenals of formal reasoning were brought into play by the early rabbinic scholars in the Roman period and later in Sasanian Persia, where the Babylonian Talmud was composed and compiled. In our comparative study of ancient Jewish and Indian scholastic literatures on ritual sacrifice, and here I would like to thank Dr. Anand Mishra from Heidelberg University, who has been a very interesting component of our discussion, we've found that the rhetorical, discursive, and thematic convergences between the two traditions are at times uncanny, even though they originated and developed in relative isolation from one another and without any evidence or likelihood of cross-pollination between them. Some parallel passages raise similar non-obvious dilemmas, and non-intuitive hermeneutic techniques are employed to entertain readings that are improbable in terms of the plain sense of the earlier texts, whether Vedic or biblical, which they seek to align with contemporary practice. One such example is the treatment of byproducts. Sacrificial rituals inevitably create waste, as sanctuaries become filled with residues and byproducts of unused animal and vegetable materia sacra, so sacred materials. What we found is not only that these two historically unrelated intellectual traditions happen to care about waste disposal, but that they expend a surprising amount of energy focusing on the treatment of ritual byproducts, including materials that could be characterized as superfluous or accidental to the ritual process, or as sacred residues, leftovers of materia sacra, and waste. So these findings corroborate claims made in previous studies. Charles Malamud comes to mind, and Francis X. Clooney in his more recent work, and also Dr. Hillel Mali's work on the treatment of leftovers in Jewish and literature from the Hellenistic and Roman periods. So to state the research question of today's experimental discussion, And I should stress that this is an experiment in discussion across fields. So this is a first step, raising more questions than offering answers, really. And this is hopefully with the assistance of our respondents. I would put it this way. If Douglas, the anthropologists, Mary Douglas and Claude Lévi-Strauss, are correct in surmising that fundamental thought categories are developed within the realm of ritual practices and reflection upon ritual practices, what can the treatment of byproducts, leftovers, and waste in these ancient ritual intellectual traditions teach us about our own perceptions of those same categories? So to begin with, I'd like to read together from 3 texts from the Israelite Jewish side of our corpus. We consider these 3 texts to be characteristic or emblematic of 3 distinct attitudes towards the ritual treatment of byproducts in ancient Israelite and early Jewish writings. These 3 distinct attitudes towards byproducts are indicative of 3 distinct ritual environmental conceptions, hence the title. Let's set forth the 3 from the very beginning so that we'll discuss them in order. Example number 1. On the one hand, such materials can be viewed as invested with sacrality, so they have some sacredness inside them, that must be exhausted within the cultic process. You have to use up all the sacredness, as every particle of holiness must be recycled within the ritual arena, allowing no material to go to waste. Option 1. Option number 2. On the other hand, sacred leftovers can be viewed as dangerous, powerful waste that must be excluded from the sacred domain, shipped off and stowed away, hidden away at a great distance from human habitation. Make sure it doesn't hurt anyone. Nobody touches it by any chance. Option 3, a third possibility, is to reconceptualize such materials as neutralized, non-sacred, non-dangerous, whereby they can become freely available for public use. Of the 3 texts that we examine, the second, in which the leftovers are eliminated by distancing them from the human habitat, derives from the book of Leviticus, the 3rd book in the Pentateuch and the Torah, of the first section of the Hebrew Bible, and the other 2 from somewhat later rabbinic texts, compiled more than half a millennium later. Now, this is no accident. I won't go into the details of the diachrony here, but I would say that although in the juncture between philology and history, and what we do, Dr. Hillel Mali and myself, is primarily philology. We study ancient texts, and we use theories to understand those texts better and use the text to understand the theories better. In other words, we're not experts by any means in sustainability. Professor Meshel, who is with us, is. So if we have questions on that aspect, I suggest that we maybe address them to her. In the juncture between philology and history, usually dynamic processes are not linear, and at any rate, not reducible to a single simple formula. So we do find, nevertheless, that elimination by distancing tends to dominate in the earliest biblical texts, whereas the other 2 attitudes tend to become increasingly explicit in later texts. This might be interesting for the discussion. That said, it's important to stress that diverse conceptualizations of ritual byproducts can sometimes be found within the very same text, and what we are examining here are what one might call 3 ideal types of ritual conceptualizations. So we will begin with example number 1, exhausting the ritual potential. The first example derives from a rabbinic text that describes the treatment of sacrificial animal and vegetable byproducts. Now, it's important to state that very often in rabbinic materials, as also in the materials in Leviticus, they don't always reflect actual ritual practice in the Jerusalem temple. which they purport to reflect. So the rabbinic texts purport to reflect the Jerusalem temple. Very often, even the earliest rabbinic texts were compiled more than a century after the year 70 CE, when the Jerusalem temple was destroyed by the Roman conquerors. And although they often contain maybe kernels of historical truths, some, like the example we will read momentarily, are purely imaginary. Now, of course, from our perspective, these are no less reliable texts. In a way, they're even more important, since what we are examining is the conceptualization of the treatment of ritual byproducts, not their actual treatment in antiquity. Idealizations often offer a perspective on society's conceptual frameworks that quotidian, so day-to-day practices do not. So this is the text. Rabbi Eleazar, the son of Tzadok, says, there was a small passageway between the sanctuary, and we have to move into a mythical voice here, right? A small passageway between the sanctuary and the altar to the west of the ramp. The ramp is the ramp of the altar. And once in every 60 or 70 years, priestly acolytes, so young people who want to serve as priests, would descend into there and gather from their coagulated wine, like fig cakes. They would bring them up and burn them sacredly, since it says, and then a verse is quoted, in the holy offer a libation, just as its libation is to be performed in holiness, so its incineration is to be performed in holiness. So this legal testimony, as it were, allegedly presents a vignette, little picture of ritual practice, as reported by Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Tzadok. The biblical law simply decrees that on certain occasions, wine and grain offerings should be offered upon the altar. The wine, however, is not consumed by the altar's fire. Rather, in the rabbinic picture, it descends through thin conduits like nostrils. Kishnei hotamin dakin is the term that the rabbinic phrasing uses. And it descends to the ground beneath the altar, where it is soaked up in some subterranean reservoir. As its kinetic energy is exhausted in the process by means of its descent through these two nostril-like conduits, and as it's soaked up in the ground beneath the altar, it gradually loses its ritual potential, but never fully so. Residues of dry wine accrue in the mythic chamber beneath the altar, the drainage system of the axis mundi, as it were, where they remain untouched for generations. And then, over time, more and more libations are made, and the residues accumulate to such a degree that young priests are imagined to rappel. So this is extreme sports, right, in the ancient temple, imagined. Rappel into the hollow chamber and scrape out coagulated wine, yain karush. So I can imagine them scraping them out with their fingers into recyclable offerings similar in size, texture, and composition to dried fig cakes. So cakes of figs that are dry, right? So they're expected to raise the leftover wine back out from the bowels of the earth and incinerate the liquid, now transformed into flammable, solid materia, sacra, in a holy manner. I would note that it's unlikely, this unlikely depiction is based on a creative reading of a biblical verse, and this is a side comment. The verse in the book of Numbers uses an extra word. The word nesech is unnecessarily, there's a noun that doesn't have to be there. But that word is singled out. The superfluous word, like the superfluous wine, has a ritual or hermeneutical potential that must be exhausted. So this creates room for the homily. In a way, the sacred text and the sacred wine are being treated in a similar way. If we have something superfluous, a little bit extra, it has to be omnisignificant. It has to mean something. So we're exhausting its hermeneutic and ritual potential. We use the term hermeneutic potential here in a way similar to the literary critic Frank Kermode in his beautiful book, The Genesis of Secrecy. He argues that certain types of obscure texts lend themselves to a special dynamic of hermeneutics whereby the readers repeatedly aim to exhaust the hermeneutic potential of the text by extracting its meaning. But every attempt to do so inevitably generates new obscurities and new hermeneutic potentials, which are ultimately inexhaustible. The ritual dynamics that arise from this rabbinic source, and we've found that it's representative of a very large class of texts, are comparable. The caked wine, even after it is raised and incinerated in a holy fashion, inevitably leaves behind it residues of ashes. And I thank Koji for this insight, which in turn must be again eliminated. So we have some sort of a cyclic process here, and a process that never quite concludes with the utter transformation of matter into energy. So here as elsewhere, one might say that the ancient hermeneutics are modeled after ritual practices. Scholars are treating texts in a way that is homologous to the matters in which priests treat materia sacra. Example number 2, removal. This example derives from chapter 6 of the book of Leviticus. And I read, again, we need to slip into a mythic mode of reading, right? The Lord, it's a shame that Hillel cannot read out loud. His voice is much, much better than mine. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, command Aaron and his sons. This is the rule of the whole burnt offering. The whole burnt offering itself shall remain on the hearth upon the altar all night until the morning, while the fire on the altar shall be kept burning. The priest shall put on his linen vestments, his linen clothing, white, after putting on his linen undergarments on his body, and he shall take up the ashes to which the fire has reduced the whole burnt offering on the altar and place them beside the altar. Then he shall take off his vestments and put on other garments and carry the ashes out to a clean place outside the camp. And this example, which is, like I said much earlier, it dates from around the mid-1st millennium BCE. Many books on this topic. I mean, it interests me, but not so important for right now. Moses, the central human protagonist of the Torah, of the 5 books of Moses, is enjoined to command his brother, the priest Aharon, the high priest, and other priests, Aharon's sons, how to treat the remainders of the regular daily whole burnt, or in Hebrew, olah, offering. This is a lamb that is to be incinerated in its entirety after it has been flayed and quartered upon the altar. As its name, whole burnt, implies, the whole burnt offering is supposed to be wholly burnt, but it isn't. In a sense, this is an embarrassment to the world and to its creator, right? In an ideal world, I guess, materia, sacra, animals and vegetables offered upon the altar to God, would come without the dross and dregs, no packages with hooves and horns and hide and other materials that are either too unpleasant to offer, like dung inside the intestines, or cannot be incinerated easily. But even in a world that's supposed to be entirely good, Tov, right, in the priestly mythology in Genesis chapter 1, the blazing fire of divine origin is not sufficiently powerful to transform all of the animal into a pleasing odor or a savory smell to the Lord, as Leviticus terms it. So at the heart of the ritual treatment of waste, there lies a profound embarrassment of sorts. Now, as we saw in the previous example, materia sacra is invested when selected with a ritual potential. This ritual potential gradually depletes as the caloric potential is exhausted by combustion. But after the fire subsides, a small residue remains. The ashes are, on the one hand, still sacred, too holy to be disposed of, just anywhere. But on the other hand, the ritual potential with which they were invested cannot be exhausted by incineration. You can't burn ashes. They are the end product of a long and ultimately never fully successful process of exhausting the caloric and ritual potential of the sacrificial victim. The law that we just read in chapter 6 of the book of Leviticus decrees that the priest is to remove these remnants from the altar in 2 stages. First, wearing the priestly holy garments. He is to remove them from the altar to a temporary location beside the altar. I guess any action performed on the altar itself must be carried out in proper attire. Then he is to change into a different set of clothing and remove them into the wilderness away from the Israelite camp. In the narrative there, the Israelites are walking through the wilderness from Egypt to the land of Canaan, right? To an area that's depicted in Leviticus as uninhabited and empty. The change of clothing is significant. In this ancient biblical portrayal, the removal of these leftovers is not perceived as part and parcel of the sacrificial cult, and thus does not require priestly garb. Rather, it's a means of distancing the byproducts from human habitat to avoid the liabilities involved in any contact with them. Their treatment then results from an inherent tension. They're still invested with a degree of ritual potential, and yet this potential cannot be exhausted. That they are still invested with a degree of sacredness and a degree of unexhausted ritual potential is evident from 2 details. First, they must be disposed of in a pure place, at least in the later texts in Leviticus, and not just anywhere. Second, the place must be way out in the vast emptiness that is the desert, being that they're invested with enough ritual potential to cause harm if contracted. This type of treatment is a mirror image of the treatment of highly polluting substances in the priestly law, according to the classic 19th century model of the Scottish Semitist William Robertson Smith, elaborated upon by the French sociologist Émile Durkheim. Pollution and sacredness were not only united in a single concept of taboo in primordial religious thinking, but they also functioned in parallel fashion within the ancient Israelite system of purity and sacrifice. By the way, the first half of their statement may or may not be true. The second half, I believe, is correct with regard to the Israelite practices. Sacred material, like polluted material, is powerful and harmful if an ordinary person inadvertently, so by mistake, comes into contact with it. And it can lead to disaster if touched. As Gunel Ekrot has argued, the analysis of material remains suggests that a similar conception was shared by other ancient Mediterranean cultures as well. So thus far, example number 2, distancing. Example 3. Reconceptualizing as non-waste. So roughly what some of my colleagues would call from waste to resource. Mishnah, Tractate Yoma, a text from the late 2nd, early 3rd century, although it contains early traditions, reads as follows. The priest, I added those 2 words for clarity, would pour the remaining blood of an offering. Again, we slip into the mythic mode of reading. Or this is legal more than just mythic. After it was sprinkled on the outer altar on its southern base. So there's an altar inside and outside. This is the outer altar. These remains of blood from the outer altar and those remainders of blood from the inner altar are mixed in the canal, or maybe aqueduct, ama, beneath the altar, and they flow out with the water used to rinse the area to the Kidron River. This is more than just a translation. I'm filling in, basing myself on a previous translation, filling in the gaps. The water was sold to gardeners for use as fertilizer. The gardeners paid for this water and thereby redeemed it from its sanctity. Failure to do so would render them guilty of misuse of consecrated property. Mu'alin bahem. The Mishnah describes the aftermath of the ritual sacrifice of purification offerings when the priest is to purge the sanctuary of pollutions that have adhered to it. The sanctuary dwells in the midst of a human congregation, exposed to a variety of anthropogenic pollutions, the bodily cycles of birth, death, and procreation, which in and of themselves are viewed positively, as well as the inevitable transgressions of the divine injunctions, which are not so positive. bring about a defilement of the divine abode as described in the book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. As in Oscar Wilde's novel Picture of Dorian Gray, as my teacher Jacob Milgram described it, the tabernacle is a transportable shrine, is designed to absorb all of the Israelites' impurities. As a result, the Israelites, like the protagonist of that novel, remain unaffected by the vicissitudes of quotidian life and death and by the injuries of sin. But the tabernacle, God's dwelling place, becomes increasingly defiled, like the painting made of the young Dorian. The purgation or purification offerings are thus designed to cleanse the sancta by means of the strongest detergent within the ancient Israelite ritual system, the blood of sacrificial animals. The ancient system preserved in the temple scroll, this is a text composed over 2,000 years ago by certain Jews who objected to contemporary practices in the Jerusalem temple. Copies of it were discovered in the previous century in the Judean desert at Qumran. So in the temple scroll, such blood mixed with water used for washing out the sanctuary's courtyard would remain dangerously potent and would need to accumulate in an underground reservoir, very much like the one we imagined in source number 1, our first example of the priests rappelling down into an underground reservoir. As we've seen, this ancient conception views every molecule of materia sacra as imbued with the ritual potential that must be exhausted within the cult, or else it's harmful. But according to some rabbinic sources, of which the present Mishnah that we just read is one, a conceptual shift took place. Once it has fulfilled its ritual purpose, in our case, once the divine injunction to apply the blood to the altar has been carried out, and Hillel Mali describes it very beautifully in a recent article, the materia sacra is no longer perceived as imbued with dangerous potencies. The blood is desanctified by the very fact that it has undergone ritual utilization. What remains of it is nothing but valuable, nutrient-rich fertilizer that is now sacred only to the very limited degree that its financial is still property of the temple treasury, so that a financial transaction has to take place in order to render it free for private or public use. As a result, the blood is described as flowing via an aqueduct or a canal, a drainage system leading to the valley of Kidron. This is real, this is not mythic, the valley exists. And farmers in the vicinity of Jerusalem are described as purchasing the blood from the temple treasury and putting it to secondary use as fertilizer for their fields. The inevitable cyclic nature of this procedure is not explicit in the Mishnah, but it is nevertheless implicit therein. These same fields, irrigated with the blood-rich waters of the Kidron stream stemming from the temple, supply the next round of animal and vegetable offering materials for the continuation of the temple cult. Now, having examined these three ancient models for thinking about waste, let's turn to a modern example where these three conceptualizations serve side by side. Needless to say, one should not expect to find a one-to-one correspondence between the ancient texts and the modern process of waste management, a topic that I believe is close to the heart of Professor Takashi Mino. Wastewater treatment, I'll say WWT with your permission, wastewater treatment mechanisms are designed to treat industrial and urban contaminated wastewater, rendering it fit for human and plant consumption. And I should thank Professor Yael Meshel and Yehuda Tungstein for the following 5-stage description. So in this case, of course, it is not a deity whose purposes are served by the commodities that yield waste, but rather human society as a whole. WWT is describable as a 5-stage process. In stage 1, it includes the removal of objects that are too large and or too heavily contaminated to enter the system. Stage 2 includes the sedimentation of the suspended particles, resulting in 2 phases: liquid on top, sludge that precipitates to the bottom. Stage 3 entails aerobic biodegradation of the suspended pollutants within the liquid, followed by additional time for sedimentation. An optional polishing process is found in stage 4, termed SAT, soil aquifer treatment. In this process, treated water is leached through the soil profile for additional purification and then pumped back up for reuse. Finally, in stage 5, the sediments from stage 2 and 3 are collected and further processed by compostation to enable reuse as fertilizer. While stage 3 biodegradation is in a sense the heart of WWT, for the purposes of today's conversation, we find the best analogs to the ritual process in other components of wastewater treatment. In environmental terms, from within the wastewater treatment process, a rough analog to the first model, so reuse of libated wine in order to exhaust its ritual potential, would be the reuse of treated wastewater following soil aquifer treatment, SAT. As noted in this process, treated wastewater is leached to the soil profile as additional purification process and then pumped back for reuse. So the water, like the Mishnaic wine, had initially been utilized for consumption. Again, in our analog, it's human consumption, not divine consumption. And following the treatment, it is retrieved and reused again. With respect to wastewater treatment, the second model, elimination by means of distancing from human habitat, is exemplified in the elimination of components that are not considered treatable and therefore are sent to be buried in landfills, usually far away from human habitation. Two examples are, one, large non-recyclable objects removed in the initial separation stage of wastewater treatment, and two, sludge that is polluted with heavy metals removed after sedimentation. The third model, fertilization of the fields with the leftover blood, correlates in environmental terms with the use of composted sludge for fertilization. Like the blood that flows into the Kidron Valley, the sludge, rich in mineral and organic nutrients, is sold to farmers as fertilizer. Its monetary value, it is sold for a price, is evidence that it is no longer conceived as waste, but has been reconceptualized as a resource. So our modest goal today has not been to explore the explanatory power of the convergences between ancient and modern conceptualizations of waste, but merely to set forth a set of concrete examples with which we could begin to ask new questions, maybe in the discussion stage, and point to correlations that relate to the potential relevance of the study of one field for a better understanding of the other, and I believe it goes in both ways. One step in this direction would be to point to the blurring of borders in some ritual contexts between waste and non-waste. So what I'm thinking is happening here is in a sense, creating a discursive space, as Professor Mayumi Fukunaga phrases it in her work on community-based conservation approach for regenerating an alternative collective mythology for us. The first step in this direction would be to point to the blurring of borders in some ritual contexts between waste and non-waste in a way that's perhaps not entirely feasible within a modern urban and industrial context, but which may nevertheless set an idealized point of reference indicating the directions in which systematic thinking about waste has led ancient thinkers. Two directions are worthy of considerations, and I will be brief. The first has to do with mythic overtones that are strongly subdued in the legal technical language of the third example that we read, about waste to resource transformation that the blood flowing out from the altar undergoes. These overtones are explicit already in poetic sections of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible. In these depictions, the overflow of superfluous materia sacra from the temple serves as a life source for the environment surrounding the temple. So it's specifically because it emanates from a sacred source that it retains some residual potency, no longer a dangerous one, that it can fructify anything that comes in contact with it. So one can think of Psalm 36, verse 9, and again in the mythic voice, I would say, Yirviyun mideshin beitecha v'nachal adanecha tashkem. So they usually translate it as they feast on the abundance of your house, but really it is the deshin, the leftover ashes that are now perceived as this flowing oily substance from your house, from the temple, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. River of delights, Nachal Adanecha recalls verbally the Garden of Eden. So we have a mythic water emanating from the temple and feeding all the fields around it. This mythic river flowing from the temple is recurrent in biblical eschatological portrayals of the temple in Ezekiel, Zechariah, Joel. Only here it's mingled with leftover materia sacra. Having been touched with sacredness, even the byproducts bestow a blessing. The second way, in which ritual thinking about waste goes beyond the three models, has to do with them being an a priori desirable component without which the ritual would be considered incomplete. So what's common to all the three models we examined is that the leftovers are secondary. I mean, they're harnessable, at worst untamable elements within the ritual environment. Even in the third example, where they're a little bit better, there's still a post hoc element. But in some of the later Talmudic texts we've examined, and there are parallels, interesting parallels in Mimamsa literature in the classical Indian scholastic science of sacrifice, the possibility is raised, at least as a theoretical alternative, that the production and disposal of waste is a sine qua non, so without which the ritual process is incomplete. In other words, a ritual procedure that does not produce byproducts to be properly disposed of is disqualified. So in one extreme formulation, the production of disposal of byproducts is sort of the raison d'etre, the reason the sacrificial process is taking place, no less than the libation of sacrificial materials, generally perceived as the primary goal. So the waste is more than just merely an unfortunate byproduct to be dealt with. It's an a priori desirable component. So according to one Talmudic text, if there's no leftover blood to be disposed of properly, a new bull needs to be brought and the ritual needs to begin anew. Imagine a birthday party where, birthday parties always leave leftover wrappers, leftover cake that hasn't been eaten. Imagine that if there are no leftovers, there are no wrappers, no leftover cake, we have to do the whole birthday party again, invite the guests, bring new gifts, bake a new cake, only to make sure that this time we have some leftovers. In terms of wastewater treatment, one could imagine an alternative mode of thinking whereby a process in which water is utilized in such an efficient way that there is no wastewater to be treated is somehow imperfect. Somehow it transgresses the most basic premises of the relations between humans and their environment. So in light of this conclusion, I intentionally leave aside some leftover residual time for Q&A and for discussion, discussion which will hopefully lead like the stream flowing forth from the sacrificial altar to cross-fertilization between two distant fields of knowledge. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Vinich, for your very, very stimulating presentation. And you said that this approach is a kind of experimental. And yes, it's really experimental. It's very challenging and stimulating because I've never thought of the residue from the ritual in the context of environmental practice or environmental concept. So we have two commentators, as I said at the beginning, and I didn't tell the names of these two commentators, but you already introduced. Thank you very much. Actually, the two commentators are Dr. Fukunaga Mayumi and Dr. Nakamura Sae. And I would like to start with Nakamura Sensei, Dr. Nakamura. Yes. Dr. Nakamura Sae is associate professor at Graduate School of Art and Science, and she specializes in anthropology and South African studies. So from her expertise, Dr. Nakamura is going to give comments and questions. So may I ask Dr. Nakamura to start your presentation?
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you, Dr. Meshel for a very how to say. I really enjoyed the mode of your switching mode of reading, and it was really inspiring. Like instead of just reading, hearing your voice made much more sense to me. And thank you so much. And I'm honored to be here to be a part of this very exciting conversation. I found it very challenging, but exciting because this is like opening conversation between seemingly quite distant field of knowledge between philology and engineering, environment and engineering. So I'm really happy to be part of this experimental conversation. So thank you very much. And as Professor Mino introduced, I am an anthropologist. I've done field work mainly in Sri Lanka, and my focus is on aging care and decaying body. But because of the geographical and cultural proximity, I am also exposed to studies on India and other South Asian societies. And as you may know, sacrificial ritual has been one of the important subjects in South Asian studies for years. So today, as a response to your talk, I would like to share my thoughts, keeping in mind some of the discussions on South Asia with which I have been familiar. Sorry if my comments might be out of context, but I hope you can bear with me because sometimes misunderstanding can be created. Okay, so my first question to start with. Okay, so I would like to ask about the relationship between sacrality and life potency in ancient Israelite and early Jewish writings. According to your talk, of the three distinct attitudes, only the third one, the waste to resource transformation, was not invested with sacredness nor viewed as dangerous. It was reconceptualized as neutralized, thus was made freely available for public or private use. In other words, in the first and second cases, sacrality or danger of byproduct is so strong that it cannot be kept with them. Whereas in the third case, a byproduct could enter the material cycle of common or profane life and thus could be sold and bought because its sacred power has faded, if not completely gone. But however, towards the end, when you were wrapping up the talk, you also said that such overflow of superfluous materia sacra serves as a life source for the environment, and that it retains some residual potency as it has emanated from sacred source. So my question is about the interpretation of this statement. What is this potency? Is it different from sacrality, or is it part of it? I think my question is related to the third question that was raised from the audience. I just read it I think it's related. I'm curious to ask this because while reading, I was reminded of a concept often referred to in anthropological studies of Indian religious rituals and practices, that is Shakti. Shakti is an unlimited power, a force that is very dangerous if it is too intense, but it refers to the generative or life force itself. The goddess, the object of the ritual, is representation of the infinite power of Shakti, while our body self is also a finite form of the same Shakti. In sacrificial rituals here too, the leftovers of the offered items becomes sacred, infused with divine power, Shakti. By consuming and ingesting leftovers of blessed food called prasad, the worshippers will incorporate part of Shakti into themselves, energizing and purifying their bodies and their internal dispositions. The leftovers of sacrificed animals, if any, is equally energized and blessed and would be ingested by those who offer animals to the gods. What I want to stress here is that such incorporation of Shakti into one's body self through consumption of ritual leftovers does not require neutralizing process. and its workings continue long after the ritual. Shakti is shared or exchanged through sexual intercourse, childbirth, breastfeeding, co-eating, etc., and gradually diminishes throughout life. So if one ages, that Shakti will gradually fade. Thus, Shakti is not a sacred or dangerous power that can be alienated from matter. It is like omnipresent power with material effect with varying degrees of intensity. So I would appreciate it if you could tell me whether such view is applicable to the textual world that you're working on, especially on the third case. I have a feeling that such monistic, so to say, worldview may be out of context, but still, if there's any interesting contrast or comparison that can be made of that, I'd like to know. So that was my first question. I think that's the central one. And the second one is a comment, rather like a comment, but it involves question. So after you showed us the correspondence between three ideal types and stages WWT, I was led to assume, maybe I'm wrong, but I was led to assume that the three ideal types can be reworded very simply as reuse, disposal, and recycle. I wondered whether these three types was obtained by inductive method, induction after examining all the materials available so far, or did you manage to somehow organize it in line with so-called modern waste management categories? And if the case was the former, I think it is an interesting coincidence. And what I mean to say is that if that's the case, the three categories presented by you may indicate the limits of human thinking about waste. And why I say limit, I say this for some reasons. One can say, for example, that what we conceptually distinguish as disposal, reuse, or recycle is concerned only about human protagonists. Take disposal, for example. We maintain and preserve clean bodies, living spaces by disposing of what we consider dirty or dangerous. We believe that we are all responsible for the cleanliness of our bodies or our living space. However, this is only true as long as the dirty things will disappear from our side immediately. The smell from the dumping site does not waft in, and the process of disposal is made invisible. When we think we are disposing of waste, we are probably diffusing it into the world, and we can only live in a chain of living entities or environments in which waste is already part of it. So even with recycle or reuse, they may be a little different from disposals. For example, we can think of unwanted clothing and plastic products for recycle being driven out of the country and accumulate in other Asian or African countries. So that was my second point. And having said that, so perhaps the waste is being diffused into the world through a process that we can neither fully understand nor manage, but we conceptualize in certain ways, as you showed us. And it's changing our lives and environment in unexpected ways. Having said that, I would like to ask my last question. Again, in the third case, in your third example, I think it applies the understanding of waste in terms of its material fluidity and sharing between human beings, plants, animals, water, land, and the sacred being. So I think this also can be relevant to the first example as well. So if so, I wondered if it is appropriate to conceptualize this third case with the word recycle or resource, as these words prioritize human agency and experience over other beings. That's, yes, I think, yeah, that's all from me, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, there are 3 questions, and now you are in a position to respond to.
So thank you very much, Professor Sai Nakamura. I think presenting the questions as 3 might be slightly misleading. I feel that each one of them was so dense that I was dividing them in my mind analytically. Question 1, I divided into 3 sections, question 2 into 2, and question 3 into 2 more. So it will be, they were, of course, they were 3 questions, and I will try to at least respond to part of them. If I don't succeed in responding to all the subcategories of each question, then I would love to continue this conversation either here or in Jerusalem or else. Question number 1, regarding the relationship between sacrality and life potency in the Jewish writings, and to what extent, what is potency? Is it different from sacrality? And then after that, you asked about the concept of Shakti and how it functions within the prasad system of eating leftovers from things that are touched by the divine. So those are maybe 2. The first, I think the first thing that comes to mind are 2 theories. They're old. They're over 100. They're about 100 years old. One is even older. But like old wine that gets coagulated, these improve with time. One is the conception of the numinous conception of the divine. The term is coined or recoined by Rudolf Otto in his book, The Idea of the Holy. And the answer to your question is essentially a resounding yes. The holy is perceived in certainly in ancient Israelite texts. He claims it's also true in other religious systems, and there may be some truth in that, of a dialectic tension between life-giving and destructive power. So there's one and the same power, I guess very much like fire, right, or nuclear energy, right, which is at once, this is the divine, inscrutable, right, an ineffable element within the divine, which is encountered as dangerous, threatening. It is life-giving if tapped according to protocol. And I think protocol is the key term in the priestly texts that we were looking at, in as much as the Levitical laws are strongly theocentric and not anthropocentric. Certainly, they do not have nature at their center, but they are outside the human domain. In other words, they are theocentric. It's the deity's purposes that are being served. Its purposes are being served. Everything else is secondary. And yes, any encounter with it can be both life-giving if performed according to protocol, but if not, and there's some stories, the sons of Aaron, they do some minor details, not even clear. It's like a bureaucratic form, and they filled out the wrong word and the wrong number on the file of the form that they were presenting. It's a fire ritual, and they're burnt and destroyed and killed. So this is a recurrent theme, both within the priestly writings and in Rudolf Otto's understanding of ancient religious systems at all. In fact, he claims that modern, and when he says modern, he's thinking of Protestant Christian modern, the conceptions of the deity is all good and the source of well-being, holiness in the sense of goodness, is to be rejected in favor of this more archaic perception of the divine. So yes, the other theory that comes to mind is William Robertson Smith's, whom I think I mentioned here, about this parallelism between the polluted, and I saw that Professor Mayumi Fukunaga also asked about this, so maybe it'll tie in, it'll dovetail the conversation. Yes, in many ways, the polluted is also the sacred. So in some profound sense, the deeply polluted and the deeply sacred behave in similar ways. They claimed, in other words, in the 19th century, it was common to claim that also historically they evolved together as simply taboo. They're the touchables and the not touchables. The touchables comprise quotidian objects, cups, plates, tables. And the non-touchables, the non-approachables, include both what we would consider today as deeply defiled and what we would consider as profoundly holy. And they claim that with time, these evolved into 2 distinct categories. There's been some pushback on this from Parker's study of Greek religion. So I don't know if historically their reconstruction is accurate, but phenomenologically, in terms of how the 2 processes behave, the sacred and the polluted, yes, they do behave often very much alike. And it does have to do this with, and this I cited Malamud, the Shakti concept of residual divinity residing in foodstuffs that can be absorbed into humanity. I hope I answered very quickly here, maybe too quickly, but I hope this at least opens an avenue for conversation. I'll try to respond very quickly. Do I have 2 more minutes to respond to the
Yes,
other
please.
questions?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. The question, so about reuse, disposal, recycle, I'll be very careful. Maybe I should defer to Professor Meshel about whether the terminologies suit. I would say yes, if by reuse you mean to use again for the same purpose as before, whereas by recycle you mean using for a different purpose, which may lead in some sort of a grander circle of consumption, feed back into the same system, then absolutely yes. And is it a coincidence or more that the 3 models that come up from the study of the ritual text? And by the way, when I first analyzed together with Dr. Hillel Mali and Dr. Anand Mishra, I should mention Mathieu Barbier, Dr. Mathieu Barbier from CNRS, when we analyzed the structures of the ritual systems, we had no knowledge whatsoever of sustainability categories of thought. So we were working with the texts on their own. Yes and no. This should be left maybe you to answer better than I could. But I think that it's important not to miss out on a major difference between the conceptual framework within which the ancient texts are operating, these ancient Jewish texts and biblical ones, and modern conceptions. In the ancient world, the Israelite perception of uninhabited land is one of vast, empty expanses. It's, for the most part, it's not a crowded world. The world that they inhabited in their imagination, and also, I mean, in reality, was not crowded as our world is. There was an outside to which things could be disposed of and presumably not be, one could say, nobody will encounter them, not an animal, not a human, not a deity. That's one way we could say that the difference is grand, right? We live in a very crowded world. My waste is your backyard, right? So this is something that is incomparable, right? This is a disanalogy between the 2 systems. But, and this leads directly into the 3rd question. So I think it's, in a way, I'm responding to question number 3 here as well. There's a qualification to the previous statement. So to clarify, before Professor Nakamura asked, is it a coincidence that reuse, dispose, recycle, those 3 models are found by chance by people studying ancient texts of temple waste, temple byproducts? I said, I'm not sure, I don't know, but let's not forget that there's a major disanalogy between the 2 systems of thought, the ancient one and the modern one. And when I say ancient here, I'm speaking of ancient Israelite in particular, within the biblical and early Jewish writings. Then I said I should qualify that a little bit, because really, I didn't say anything about this, but somewhere in the background of our priestly authors, there is something out there in the wilderness where all the waste goes, where this miasma, or polluted material that needs to be disposed of, cleansed from the sanctuary and removed. And the term tohu, yelel, yeshimon, these are terms of emptiness that are used, but there's also there are creatures out there. They are sometimes described as demons. In one famous text, in chapter 16 of Leviticus, maybe I don't know, in the Jewish calendar, we just had the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, yesterday, and this is a chapter that describes that those rituals that are to be performed for the purgation of the temple. There's another deity, another god, apparently, or divine creature, I don't know what to call him, called Azazel, and he's this monstrous, I'm just imagining, with horns and teeth and blood, and the thing he revels in receiving, this demon / deity, Azazel, he revels in receiving a goat, which is a sort of sacrificial animal, but with instead of ketchup and mustard. So what he likes is sin and impurity and pollutions. Those are what he likes as side dishes together with his goat. So in a way, it is inhabited by dangerous inhabitants. This too is very different from the modern, the model that we're dealing with mass production of waste and the natural backyard of ours is no longer a threat in the way that it was perceived to the ancient writers. So maybe just one line I would say, yes, the analogies are striking. Let us not forget that we are, after all, also dealing with very different perceptions of the world, of the cosmos, who inhabits it, what inhabits it, how dangerous is it to us, and how much of a threat are we to the world, we as humans. Yeah. Thank you so much. I hope that answered a little bit.
Well, actually, this is a very interesting discussion, and probably the analogy of the ancient matter does not always go with the understanding of the present practice. But at least we see something new by thinking about this analogy. Actually, that's very interesting. But we have to move to the next commentator.
Sure.
Sorry. Professor Dr. Fukunaga. Dr. Fukunaga Mayumi, she is Associate Professor at the Graduate School of Frontier Sciences, and she specializes in environmental ethics. So from ethical point of view, I would expect some comment and questions. Fukunaga Sensei, please.
Thank you for your introduction. And first, I would like to thank you, Dr. Meshel, for your fascinating lecture. I think it would be a good idea to take you to the lovely river in Japan. And where they're filled with different mythical atmospheres and powers from yours. So I was intrigued by your work intersecting two disciplines, religious textual interpretation and wastewater treatment engineering. I am excited that the discussions among us today will offer a fresh perspective on the politics of making boundaries between waste and non-waste, or more directly between disposal and recycling, which I have been dealing with in several case studies this decade. Well, as an environmental sociologist and ethicist, a part of my research focuses on the renaturalization process of ecological and capitalistic ruins after they have been consumed, polluted, and abandoned by anthropogenic activities, with particular attention to the watershed as a cultural and geographical unit. So how can we restore or even regenerate ecological systems for our habitable Earth in ruins? When we say our habitable planet, who and what are included in us, these are essential questions to consider in the time of the Anthropocene, as you know. How can we human beings contribute to the Earth's future as a more than human world? So in your presentation, Dr. Meshel focused on two objectives, I assume. One is to find in the three attitudes toward the ritual byproducts in the biblical and surreal texts a set of concepts shared in current environmental governance, as we discussed. The second is to seek perspectives from recent cases that can shed new light on the interpretations of religious texts. I would also like to align my comments with Dr. Meshel's two-pronged explorations of those. So the first question I'd like to ask is the relationships between waste, things to be disposed of, and dirt, things considered polluted and dangerous in these ancient religious worlds. Maybe this question in your lecture's context partially overlaps the one you raised already. What would be the border and the politics between waste and non-waste? I ask this because in the modern world, the two concepts, waste and dirt, are inseparably entangled and constitute a system of meaning and symbol that organizes individuals, groups, and institutions and drives our society as a part of the social systems. The waste-dirt system, I'd like to call it, parallels and is complicit with the ones of production consumption, and therein lies the vexing dilemma surrounding environmental problems called environmental injustice. So let me explain how such a waste-dirt system works in our society briefly. So the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman describes in his book, Wasted Lives, immigrants who are marginalized, considered socially disordered, but qualified to be disposable labor, and the economically vulnerable without lower consumption power in the market, and the socially stigmatized. They are excluded from social recognition with respect and from the institution supposed to support their livelihoods. In the classic words of Mary Douglas, as you know, eliminating it is not a negative movement, but a positive effort to organize the environment. So not only immigrants are exposed to such vulnerability and precarity, but also those who are excluded from the labor market and lose consumption power due to illness, unemployment, etc. this group became qualified to be dirt, even if they only happen to fit such an unfortunate situation. Moreover, it is these disposable workers who sustain the waste disposal processes of our society. It is a space with lower monetary and resource values where waste is eliminated. Already, we actually talked about the demo spaces. And working and being used in the process of waste disposal gives additional social stigma to workers and areas. However, the vulnerable have no choice but to continue working as cheap labor or offering their lands as landfill space to buy tomorrow's bread. As such, a negative cycle of the waste dirt system continues to expand environmental injustice globally. George Agamben might call such abundant people homosexual, excluded from rituals, and denied their sovereignty, whom the modern society produced for their development. So the story of homosexual overlaps with the history of the vulnerable in Japan too. The victims of pollution, such as Minamata disease, are mercury poisoned people, or those who were called the abandoned in the shadow of the economic growth of the nation state. They have been discarded as dirt, with their polluted hometowns recognized as those who would disturb the social order that placed the highest priority on economic growth. For the sake of national development, environmental pollution and its victims were unavoidable sacrifices. Such a discourse became a master narrative under the waste dirt system, which accomplishes to the production consumption system. Well, on the contrary, if you look at the current the academic discourses, ecofeminist Maremis, geographer David Harvey, and others have already argued that global capitalism needs infinitely exploitable resources. Therefore, it needs a waste dirt system as its accomplice to produce and keep human resources and species available for more enhancement of its production consumption system. So no more willingness to be colonized, maybe no more demon willingness. So the global economy grows the substitutes by itself. Such a self-generating movements of global capitalism echoes the discussion by you in your conclusion. The production of waste and its disposal were essential conditions for the ritual. And you said actually previously we actually read your article, and there you said that the possibility is raised at least as a theoretical alternative that the production and the subsequent disposal of waste is a sine canon, without which the ritual process is incomplete. In other words, a ritual procedure that does not produce byproducts to be appropriately disposed of is thereby disqualified. In one extreme formulation, the production and the disposal of byproducts are the raison d'etre of the sacrificial ritual process, no less than the oblation of sacrificial materials generally perceived as a primary goal. So waste is more than merely an unfortunate byproduct to be dealt with. It is an a priori desirable component of the ritual process. So the ritual process needs byproducts to establish itself, in my understanding. And a cycle was formed in which waste blood nourished the earth and nurtured the plants and animals to be sacrificed to maintain the ritual. Well, the global capitalism creates a never-ending circle of circulated exploitation, and the waste dirt system leads its movement. Can we see some partial overlaps between the two descriptions? Maybe my attempt stretches too much far from your discussion. However, I believe that by projecting the worlds of contemporary society and classical texts onto each other, we may gain new insights to challenge our problems. So how can we stand in solidarity with a vulnerable and transform social system that seems to continue to drop into the abyss? To face this great challenge, we must clarify how the waste dirt system works in accordance with the production consumption system. What is the politics of boundary of making between waste and non-waste? What is the nature of the complicity between waste and dirt? These questions may seem far-fetched for the realization of environmental justice, but they are questions that will lead us most quickly toward a solution, I believe. So the light cast by the ancient texts may help us to think deeply about these questions, I believe. And my second question comes in the form of a suggestion. I suggest that by intersecting the three ancient models with the radioactive waste issue, we can explore a new realm of environmental thoughts. So Dr. Meshel contrasted his discussion of ancient rituals with the wastewater treatment. In my understanding, he you chose WWT for its textual and expressive engagement with wine and river of blood spill as ritual waste, as well as we could clearly see the analogs well with the ancient three attitudes toward waste: reuse, segregation and elimination of waste, and neutralization. The reason I propose to intersect these terms with the case of radioactive waste is very simple. It seems to involve different patterns of bordering between waste and non-waste than the above three. Of course, all three attitudes in the ancient ritual processes are also included in nuclear waste management. Firstly, nuclear waste is processed into max fuel for reuse. Well, we are expecting, but not actually. And now reusable waste is aimed for isolation and geological disposal. And the byproduct of hot water and low radioactive waste is diluted and diffused into the material cycle to become soil and water for the next generation of life. So nuclear waste disposal, however, requires a different attitude toward waste than these. That is, it requires embedding the debris in the mythical lengths of time. Neutralization of nuclear waste requires an unimaginable length of time of 100,000 years, or maybe we can say deep time, geologic time, just as Finland chose a waterless site where the earth has not moved for 2 billion years to build a geological repository, as it means a suitable disposable site is outside the life and material cycles we can imagine and feel. We must imagine what would be waste and non-waste with a view outside of human perceptual understanding. It seems to me that mythic thinking needs to be recalled. So what, if anything, can be newly eliminated in these cases by ancient texts filled with mythic thinking and mythic environments? That much more far more fetched, but I'd like to ask these questions to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
I'll take a few minutes to respond, and I'll try to be brief. I want to say from the outset that I had a chance only like a couple minutes before our discussion to glance at some of your questions, and I find them very, very intriguing. Some of them I have a simple answer: I don't know, and I hadn't thought about them. And they, for example, I'd never thought about the possibility of thinking in terms of work power, residual work power, as a necessary component for a functioning economy. So we have to have some percentage of unemployed people in order for the economy to function. I never thought of this as a parallel, but of course, in Mary Douglas's terms of the parallels of the structures of human societies and the structures of their ordering dirt and waste. And I don't know if dirt and waste are the character. I'll turn to them in a minute. So that's a very interesting direction of thought. I want to think about that before I respond. Now I'll backtrack and I'll start with the, again, also here, there were more than really 2 questions. There were, I think, at least 5, and I'll try to pick out and respond to them accordingly. So the relation between who is us, right? Who is us, and what is waste versus dirt? And these are 2 interrelated questions, and I think it's no coincidence that Mary Douglas's work comes to mind. Just to clarify to some of the other people who are participating today, the British anthropologist Mary Douglas perceives the difference between what is dirt and what is not dirt by means of an example. This is my example, not hers, but I've used it in the past, and I think she would agree with this example. If I am eating, I'm making soup, I have a new pot of soup, and I also have socks that I just bought from the supermarket, so they're clean, and one of the socks falls into the bowl of soup, I cannot serve the soup to a guest because the sock has defiled the soup. But if I'm eating soup and the soup a drop of soup has fallen on my sock, now the soup has defiled the sock. So these are not absolute categories of what's, infectious, what's unhygienic, but these are dirt is, as Mary Douglas says, matter out of place. So what is the relation between dirt and waste? Well, it very much depends on our conceptualization of waste. If waste is in its proper place, then perhaps it is not dirt at all. And these are maybe when we speak of reconceptualization, this is precisely the mechanism by means of which waste or dirt out of place becomes dirt in its place and hence no longer dirt. That's what I'm saying. The reason this is related to the question of who is us, and this is actually very interesting. I never understood this aspect of Douglas's writing very well, but in her argument, it is not always that those interstitial, so those parts of the animal world or of the material world that don't fit neatly into categorizes, into squares, not in every society are they perceived as dangerous and unwanted. She has a very famous example of the lily of southern Sudan, right, with the pangolin, where once a year, on special occasions, I don't remember if it's once a year, but on special occasions, the pangolin, who does not, this is an animal that has scales like a fish, but it crawls like a raccoon, right? It has properties of other, it's a mammal, but it behaves, it climbs trees like a reptile. So the value of it is actually, this maybe is a little bit similar to Professor Nakamura's question. It is both, it is in this case not dangerous, but it's actually profitable, and it's powerful and desirable, and consuming it contains some sort of shakti, right? It is sort of there's some strength in devouring it. So it depends on and what determines whether a society will perceive such animals or such creatures as dirt or as non-dirt. That depends on their social structure, whether they tend to be endogamous or exogamous, right? These are questions of the structure of society vis-a-vis the structure of the natural world as we classify it. So to bring us to the ancient Israelite system, I think I'm only thinking out loud right now. So I'm thinking through these concepts as I respond to you, and I hope I may retract and I may change my answer as I go, because I'm trying to think as I'm buying time by speaking slowly. I think of in the priestly writings, and Professor Jacob Milgram described this very clearly, the non-us, so the non-Israelites, so which comprises obviously most of the world, but since it's a very ethnocentric text, they're perceived as sort of the minorities out there, right? They do not defile. In all likelihood, it appears that non-Israelites in the priestly text, there's a few verses that are tricky here, but this is the general picture. They're neither defiling nor can they become defiled. They're in a way like part of the natural world, like stones, trees, living animals out there. Living animals also do not become defiled or do not defile in the priestly laws in the ancient Israelite religious system. So the ones who are non-us are not defiling in any way. In fact, they don't even qualify to be perceived as dirt, to be perceived as defiling. They're just natural, part of the natural world. It's only later, and this is very, and Mary Douglas, by the way, she retracted. At first, she claimed that the non-us are perceived as defiling, and then she retracted and said that the priestly system is all about incorporation of the liminal elements of society, and the purification systems are not about marginalization. I'm not sure I was convinced by her retraction. In other words, her first description, there might be truth in both ways of description. I would say for the earlier texts, and I'll try to speak clearly. The earlier texts, the non-us are not perceived as defiling. In fact, they're not part of the game. And I would say that the system is not about marginalization. It's about reincorporation. So it's purity is always temporary, and purity is never bad. In other words, the things that are most defiling are like childbirth and things that are not perceived as negative. In fact, they're encouraged in the priestly system. But in later texts, beginning, and this is a long discussion, so Professor Christine Hayes has written on this, Vered Noam, correcting Hayes's concepts in many ways, has recently written a nice analysis of Gentile impurity in early Jewish writings. Gradually, with time, the non-us are perceived as more and more defiling. So there's again a diachronic process here. I hope my answer wasn't too long on that, and it's sort of, so I'd say also here we have to distinguish between early stages and later developments. Maybe I'll say one more word. And here I must admit, I never thought carefully about the economic analogies that you drew. And there is a leap here. In other words, there's a leap, marginalized work power vis-a-vis dirt. It's not I wouldn't say they're the same things, but I would say that it has become in recent years more and more common to speak of the priestly writings as a product of the Persian era, and in the Persian province of Yehud, where these texts were presumably maybe not first written, but compiled and where they reached their final form. It is common to speak of a new economic system, more commercial, more urban, with the no longer an agricultural, purely agricultural society. So there's room to think here in new terms. And this is precisely what I was hoping to get out of our discussion. So thank you so much. I tried to keep it short.
Okay. Well,
Thank you.
this is a kind of very profound discussion, and
Yeah,
very
interesting. Thank you.
Well, what shall we do? We have only 5 minutes left, and there are already many questions, 11 questions from the audience. So maybe I would like to pick up one.
Please. You go ahead, please.
One question.
Should I read it out loud?
Yeah, well, I will try to explain. Actually, the question is given in Japanese, so for me, it's a bit difficult task to really translate this to English. But the question number 2, according to Durkheim, you know this.
Yeah, Emile Durkheim. We mentioned him shortly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it is easy to understand the saying that sacredness and kegare is a kind of dirty, are taboo and united. And I have heard that the kami, kami in Japan was a kind of a mixture of gods and calamities in ancient times. And I think that it has also been said that what is this? It has also been said that if a person who died in a kind of tragic situation may become a god, the way of thinking. And it is a kind of ritual that it's a kind of ritual to place calamities in people's life as God, and by doing so avoid disaster, or to cherish forest rocks or natural matters and tools in nature workshop. To cherish these things, natural things, and I think the person who questioned, I think these examples, these are a good example to of how to deal with current environmental problem. So this is the way to the difficulty. And how do you compare and analyze these examples with the term neutralization, which you explained?
Well, okay. So thank you for the question. It's not an easy question to respond to, but I'll try to do it in less than 2 minutes. Emile Durkheim, in a sense, the father of modern sociology, and we mentioned briefly earlier in our talk, is I think you're pointing to a very central aspect of his writings, which could be described as follows: rather than ancient societies worshiping a specific deity who is out there in nature, in a rock, in a tree, in heavens, in his perception, modern nation states are, in a sense, or it doesn't have to be not modern nation states, it can also go back to ethnic groups, perceiving their unity in terms of the divinity. So the flag of the United States, if I disrespect the flag of the United States, I am disrespecting the divine in American societies. That's to say it very simply in simple terms. This maybe leads us a little bit to Fukunaga Mayumi's comments about how in a desacralized society, or how in a secularized society, do we perceive of these desecrations of the divine. And in terms of marginalization, I can think of one example that might be helpful for us to discuss. Yes, the society that is based on let's say a social contract rather than on a perception of a nation state might require us to think in new terms of what is defilement and what is holiness. But that's just by way of a hint to a possible response, and I think we'll leave this for future discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, the time is passing so quickly, and it's 5:30. I have to conclude the today's session now. I would like to express my sincere thanks to Dr. Meshel for your very stimulating and outstanding lecture presentation and the discussion following. And I also would like to thank you, Dr. Fukunaga and Dr. Nakamura, for your contribution to the very exciting discussions. Thank you very much. And of course, I also thank you for the audience for your participation. I hope you enjoyed it. Actually, we have got many questions, and we could not really answer all these questions. But I will pass these questions to Dr. Meshel and to commentators, and definitely this would be a very significant contribution to the future discussion. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
So by this, I would like to conclude today's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.